Hello. You're on mute, so I can't hear you.
Hi,
Hi.
how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Good detective work on the photo.
Thank you.
Also, James Michael Curley's last day in office as governor, and he left to get married. I mean, you covered a lot, so that was.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Professor Allison, I think I went to that extra credit thing, didn't I?
I don't know.
I went to something. It was a long one. It was like, I don't know. I don't even know what, sometimes I don't know what day it is because I work so much. But no, I did go. Did you not see me sign in to one of those events?
I saw you sign in at one that I attended, but I didn't attend the one from last week, so I.
No, yeah,
tell you.
yeah, it was like with that guy. I'd have to look it up. And then I attended.
Yeah.
I've attended two of them.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, and then the summary was due today on the blog, correct?
Your mystery photo?
Yeah.
Yes, and you did
Okay,
a good job.
Thanks. Did you talk to Henry Lee at all yet?
I haven't. I called him. He wasn't answering. So keep trying.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Sounds good. Okay. Oh wait, do you have COVID?
Well, I tested positive, so yes, I think so.
Oh yeah. My friend had it, and it was really bad. How is it?
Really, it's not. It's not bad. I did get vaccinated last week, but
Oh, nice.
then tested positive on Tuesday. Other members of the household are in worse shape, so.
Oh, okay, that's good.
It's not good.
Wait, did you say they didn't test? They didn't test positive?
Well, they haven't been tested, but they're sick.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Let me see, I'm just making a note of who is here.
I also wanted to grab that Go camera from you today, but apparently that's not going to happen. So
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's that's throwing a wrinkle into things.
yeah, no problem. Like I just was with my friend today, so I don't know. We were gonna go do it, but I was like, I don't think it's happening. Okay.
We'll have to go with Plan B.
What's Plan B?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Okay, any other questions? How's everyone doing?
Pretty okay.
Great. How about yourself?
I'm doing okay, thank you. And so, okay, well, I thought what I would do today is talk a little bit about Boston at the time of the Civil War. So let's see if I can figure out how to do this. Okay, so, last time I did mention, I think, well, it's one of the big stories in Boston, early 19th century, the building of the Bunker Hill Monument, commemorating, of course, the Battle of June 17th, 1775. And as I think I mentioned, it took about 18 years to build this monument. And the cornerstone was laid in 1825, 50th anniversary of the battle. The Marquis de Lafayette came, last surviving major general from the war. And actually, Lafayette, when he went back to France, took with him a barrel filled with dirt from Bunker Hill so he could be buried in it. He was not at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He came to the United States the following year, but spent a good deal of time in Boston in 1824 and 1825, which is why, of course, the mall along the Common is known as the Lafayette Mall. And there may still be a Lafayette Hotel and Lafayette Place. And by the way, there also are a number of streets in Boston named either Lafayette or LaGrange. LaGrange was Lafayette's home in France. So anywhere in the country where you see LaGrange, it's in honor of Lafayette and his home in France. And the principal speaker at the 50th anniversary commemoration of the battle and the dedication of the monument was Daniel Webster, then a rising star in American politics, as well as one of the great orators of the 19th century. And 18 years later, when the monument was finished, Webster spoke at the dedication. An older man, no longer the rising star. He still entertained hopes of being elected president, fading hopes, I should say. And he, at the time of the dedication of the monument in 1843 or 1844, was Secretary of State. And also attending the ceremony was the President of the United States, John Tyler. And because Tyler was going to be attending this ceremony, along with Daniel Webster, John Quincy Adams, former president and someone who remembered the day of the battle, refused to attend. And he wrote in his diary that the shadow of the president's nose will obscure the monument being raised on Breed's Hill. Adams, suffice it to say, did not like either President Tyler or Secretary of State Webster. In fact, Adams wrote in his diary that Daniel Webster is a heartless traitor to the cause of humanity, which I'm not quite sure if that is accurate, but just gives us a sense of why these two guys really didn't like each other, and enough to keep Adams away from the dedication of the monument. So, let me see, for some reason, my screen has stopped advancing. Boston is really changing in the 19th century. You have this marker of the revolution, but of course things are much different. Here's a map showing Boston at the middle of the century. And you can see it is a much more crowded place than it had been before. You can see, I'm sorry. Here you see East Boston in the Noddles Island, which had been part of the city for a long time, but at this time the streets have been laid out. Very important shipping point, bringing in people as well as shipping goods out, the goods leaving by way of the Middlesex Canal, put on ships either in the North End or in East Boston for shipment to the rest of the world. And to the west of the downtown, you can see the filled in Back Bay. The streets haven't yet been named or even built. You know, the filling in of the Back Bay really begins in the 1850s as a way of allowing the city to spread this way, as opposed to being compacted. You know, the area of Fort Hill, which I mentioned, in the North End, very densely crowded areas. East Boston had been laid out with nice straight streets, as had South Boston, really. And South Boston at this time extends up to about Dorchester Street. And again, a lot of factories here along the South Bay. And we'll talk a little bit more about them in a bit. Boston's very much an industrial city in the 19th century. You have the industries of Lowell and Lawrence really being essential to the industry and the economy of all of New England. And Boston is the hub of this tremendous industrial economy. And there also is a good deal of manufacturing in Boston. And one of the most important industries actually is centered in East Boston, although you also have shipbuilders in South Boston. This is Donald McKay, who was an immigrant from Nova Scotia, and in the 1840s comes to the waterfront in East Boston and opens a shipyard which produces some of the fastest sailing ships ever built. The Flying Cloud, the Sovereign of the Seas, the Great Republic. In fact, the Flying Cloud set a record of some 89 days and a few hours to make to sail from New York to San Francisco at the time of the California Gold Rush, and ships would go around the tip of South America. And it's really essential to have fast sailing ships that could go to California and back quickly. And McKay is building these very fast and very graceful sailing vessels in the 1840s and 1850s. At the same time, there are Boston shipbuilders beginning to work in ironclad vessels and steam-powered vessels. And during the Civil War, which we'll get to, they're building monitors and others. Get back, I'm sorry for being distracted briefly with Donald McKay and that story of Boston. Here is a political cartoon of one reason why John Quincy Adams and others would not like Daniel Webster. And here in 1850, there was a big potential split in the United States between the free states and the slave states, as the slave states were threatening to secede from the Union because they saw the drift of things being against the institution of slavery, and particularly against allowing slavery to spread into the American territories. And there was a very carefully elaborated compromise to prevent the southern states from seceding. And Daniel Webster, who was a senator from Massachusetts at this time, was no longer Secretary of State. He'd been elected again to the Senate, spoke in favor of the compromise measures, including a stronger fugitive slave law, a law which would allow federal force to be used to recover fugitives from slavery, even in Boston. I think I talked a little bit last time about Anthony Burns. This is shortly before, Webster shortly after this. You can see in this cartoon, he is being ridden by a slave owner who has a lasso trying to apprehend fugitives who are being protected by William Lloyd Garrison, the publisher of The Liberator. Webster died shortly after this. He was defeated for re-election by the Massachusetts legislature. At that time, the legislatures chose members of the Senate, and Webster died. And immediately, you can see abolitionists did not like Webster. However, he still had enough friends. Again, you don't serve for a long time in public life without making both friends and enemies. And Webster made both. And his friends wanted to mark his passing by building what they thought would be an appropriate monument to him in the Boston Public Garden. The garden recently laid out, well, actually, we're looking here. This is Beacon Street. Oops. Beacon Street here. You can see the back bay has not yet been filled in. This is the early 1850s. And the public garden is still kind of a speculative an idea here on the edge of the town. And what will we put in the public garden? And some of Webster's friends thought the appropriate thing would be a statue of Daniel Webster, which actually would be one of the largest statues in Boston. In fact, at this time, there weren't any statues in Boston. This is about 4 years before the statue of Benjamin Franklin is put up in the granary. So this is an enormous statue of Daniel Webster, which kind of gives us a sense of how large he seemed at the time. You can see how small are the people here whom it was believed would come to the public garden to admire the statue of Daniel Webster. It would be one of the largest things in Boston. It gives us kind of a sense, even though I've just led you to think that Webster was a deeply unpopular person, John Quincy Adams calling him a heartless traitor to the cause of humanity. Here you see support for an enormous statue of Webster that would dominate the public garden. The statue's never built, and they do settle for a more modest statue of Webster, which stands in front of the State House. And this statue went up in the late 1850s, shortly after the Franklin statue. And the statue was the work of a sculptor named Hiram Powers, one of the eminent 19th century American sculptors. And Powers was best known at the time for this sculpture he had done of a Greek slave. This is at a time when Greece was fighting for independence from the Ottoman Empire, and a lot of Americans were captivated by the idea of Greece and the Greek Republic and Greek democracy fighting against Ottoman tyranny. And the statue of the Greek slave, which is now in the Brooklyn Museum of Art, became a real icon of the anti-slavery movement. Here, people would pay to come and see this statue, which Powers really made as a representation of slavery, of this very graceful figure of the Greek slave who is in chains. She's otherwise naked but pure, and she is really a symbol of the anti-slavery movement. It's something of an irony that you have Hiram Powers, who makes one of the important anti-slavery icons, also then is chosen to do the sculpture of Daniel Webster. And the reason Webster had been written out of politics in Boston was because of his support for slave owners. So its life is filled with ironies. But anyway, Webster's statue goes up in front of the State House, where it still is. And we'll come back to this later on. Okay. Now, I mentioned last time too, with the outcome of the Fugitive Slave Law, you have in the early 1850s, the rendition of Shadrach Minkins, and then in 1854, the big cause of Anthony Burns, the rendition of Anthony Burns, attempted rendition of Anthony Burns. Burns is returned to slavery. And what happens in this case is the Boston Vigilance Committee, led by Lewis Hayden, this gentleman here, fails to rescue Burns from the courthouse, and Burns is returned to slavery. And this is one of the precipitating events in a bigger division happening over the institution of slavery. Just to put it simply, slavery is the cause of the Civil War, but it's not simply that half of the country were morally pure and regarded slavery as an evil, and the other half thought that slavery was a necessary evil at most, or perhaps something that we can learn to live with, or some would say a positive good. You have an argument, that kind of an argument, but the real argument is, should slavery be allowed to spread into the new federal territories? And how much complicity do people who are not part of the slave system have in upholding it? And here in the case of Anthony Burns, Bostonians learn that they have to support the institution of slavery, because if someone escapes from slavery and comes to Boston, they are legally obligated to help return the person to slavery, no matter how virulently and morally opposed to the institution of slavery they are. And so that's a choice people are making. Do we stick with the Union, or do we stick with our consciences? And in Massachusetts, there is a political division between in what had been the Whig Party, the party that emerged in opposition to Andrew Jackson, between what were called the Cotton Whigs, the Whigs who were engaged in the textile industry and thus were relied on cotton from the southern states to keep the mills in Lowell and Lawrence and other industrial places going, and the conscience Whigs, those who were motivated by conscience to oppose the institution of slavery. You have this very uneasy alliance in the Whig Party. The Democrats didn't have so many moral scruples. The Democrats tended to accept that slavery was okay. And the Democrats also were the party of immigrants. And you have all of this complexity here, with the Democrats pretty much saying, well, if people want to have slavery in the southern states, they should be able to. And who are we to complain? On the other hand, the Whigs have this big division, which ultimately is going to lead to the collapse of the Whig Party in the 1850s. Here's more about Anthony Burns. And big arguments among folks about the efficacy of slavery. Here you see two individuals who are on different sides in this. This is John Andrew. Andrew was a member of the state legislature from, I believe, Dedham. And this is Thomas Cass. Cass, Irish immigrant, in 1860 becomes actually the first Irish Catholic elected to public office in Boston. In 1854, Cass was the commander of the Columbian Guards, a militia unit, and the Columbian Guards had taken Anthony Burns from the courthouse down to the dock so he could be returned to slavery. Cass, of course, is a Democrat. And what happens immediately after this in 1854, I mentioned the Whig Party collapses. The Whig Party isn't immediately replaced by an anti-slavery party. Real political power in Massachusetts in 1854, 1855 goes to a anti-immigrant party, the American Party or Know Nothing Party. And their argument was slavery is really a distraction. The much more serious issue is the large number of Irish Catholics flooding into the country, changing American institutions, and what we should do to prevent the takeover by Irish Catholics is to, clamp down on political rights for Irish immigrants. And they Know Nothings, one reason they get the name Know Nothing is there's a wave of burning of Catholic churches at this time. Last time I mentioned the burning of the Ursuline convent in the early 1830s. That was kind of an early episode. After the 1840s, there was a huge influx of Irish immigrants into the United States. And one way that American Protestants showed their displeasure with the arrival of Catholic immigrants was to burn down Catholic churches. And the story goes that when the firefighters would arrive on the scene of a burning church, there would be a crowd standing around with torches who knew nothing about what had just happened here. And in Massachusetts, the Know Nothings do sweep all of the elected offices in 1854 and 1855. And one of the first things they do is disarm the Columbian Guards. They don't want to have this group of Irish guys with weapons And of course, there is this residual. They were the guys who took Anthony Burns back to slavery. So we're not that upset that they are disarmed then in 1855 by the Know Nothings. Ultimately, what happens is the Know Nothings are voted out and a new political party is created, really dedicated to stopping the spread of slavery. And this will be the Republican Party. And John Andrew will be one of the founders of the Republican Party in Massachusetts. Here's another political player at the time. By the way, I'm mentioning all of these characters because each one will play a very important role in the Civil War that in the middle of the 1850s, I don't think any of them anticipated happening. Benjamin Franklin Butler is the rather portly fellow on the right, a Democrat, member of the legislature, member of Congress, and Butler also is the Adjutant General of Massachusetts's military forces, which at this time was a political position. It means he's in charge of all the militia forces in Massachusetts. And Butler, a Democrat, is indifferent to the institution of slavery. He's not indifferent at all to John Andrew, whom he regards as a pretentious and hypocritical, self-serving politician. And Butler knew something about self-serving politicians, since he would admit that he also was a self-serving politician. And when the Civil War begins, Andrew is the governor of Massachusetts and really is responsible for the fact that the first American troops that go to the defense of Washington go from Massachusetts, recognizing that there is going to be a rebellion. And when the war broke out in April of 1861 with the Confederate South Carolina militia firing on Fort Sumter, Andrew has troops leave Massachusetts almost immediately. However, the chief military figure in Massachusetts was Butler, so Butler actually leads this army to the defense of the Union. And Butler really didn't like Andrew. However, he does support saving the Union, even though he thought the Republicans probably had brought the war on by their hyperactivity over the issue of slavery. But we'll get back. Well, this might be a good time just to talk a little bit about what Butler does on his way down to Washington. When the war begins, in April of 1861, abolitionists welcomed the coming of the war because they saw that the war ultimately would lead to the end of slavery. They weren't certain of that, but they thought if we can make the war about slavery, it will lead to victory. It wasn't clear that that would happen. And Butler leads the army to the defense of Washington, and they have to pass through Baltimore. And in passing through Baltimore, they're attacked by a Democratic mob, and a number of the Massachusetts troops are killed in this encounter on the 19th of April of 1861. First Massachusetts troops to die in the Civil War on April 19th. And what is the significance, by the way, of April 19th in Massachusetts history? Or in American history?
Lexington and Concord.
It's the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Thank you, Seth. So a date people would have known. And here you have Massachusetts troops killed in Baltimore on their way to the defense of Washington. By the way, Butler also has another group that goes by way of Annapolis. Actually, they learn in Annapolis. This is where the Naval Academy was then. And at the Naval Academy is the Uss Constitution, which was then being used as a training ship. And there is a plot by Confederate sympathizers in Maryland to seize the Constitution. I should say that when the Navy base at Norfolk had been seized by Confederate sympathizers, the frigate United States had been taken by the Confederates. And Butler wants to prevent the USS Constitution, the storied ship from the War of 1812, known affectionately then as Old Ironsides and still as Old Ironsides. He wants to prevent it from falling into their hands. And the problem was none of the officers in training at the United States Naval Academy knew how to sail a ship. So Butler dispatches some of his men who are fishermen or commercial mariners from Gloucester and Marblehead to the USS Constitution, and they successfully sail the ship out of Annapolis and sail her to Newport, Rhode Island, where she will stay along with the Naval Academy for the remainder of the war. So Butler saves the Constitution and then gets his troops to the defense of Washington, encountering, as I said, a mob in Baltimore, which leads to the first casualties of Massachusetts troops. And Butler is going to be sent to the coast of Virginia, Fortress Monroe, at the tip of the peninsula formed by the James River and the York Rivers in Virginia. And late in May, 3 African Americans appear at the fort. Remember, Butler's not an abolitionist. And these 3 guys were enslaved by people who now were fighting against the United States. And they reported to the commander of the fort, who then, they reported to the officer they met, who then brings them to General Butler, that they had been put to work building fortifications for the enemy. And so I should say that in and around Washington, the Union Army there would allow slave owners to come through the Union lines to recover their fugitive property. The United States was still officially enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and allowing the recovery of fugitives from slavery. But Butler sees this situation as a little different, because here, these people were being put to work by the enemy. That's one thing. Secondly, Butler realizes it's not simply a war between armies. It's really a war between economies. And if we deprive the Confederates of their enslaved labor force, we can shorten the war. So he tells these 3 people who have reported to him that because the enemy has put them to work for military purposes, the enemy has forfeited their property, these people as property. He says, you now actually work for us. We're going to pay you. You're free to go if you want to, but you are contraband. That is, contraband is property that is forfeited because it's being used for a military purpose. Kind of an interesting and elaborate phraseology here, but by the end of the month, there are about 1,000 more people at the fort who have come saying, we've been put to work by the enemy. And this is the opening of what will become the end of slavery. Congress ratifies this by passing a Confiscation Act in the summer of 1861, saying that property used by the enemy for a military purpose is going to be confiscated. And this is going to become the way slavery ends. By the way, this is something that really infuriates Governor Andrew, who's an abolitionist. And Butler's not an abolitionist. He's just doing this for pragmatic reasons. But again, Butler was always doing things for pragmatic reasons. Butler later on is sent to be the military commander in New Orleans after the United States seizes New Orleans from the Confederacy. And he is, again, Democrat, not really happy with the Lincoln administration, but he's going to save the Union and also end slavery. And as the commander in New Orleans, he also has carved on the base of the statue of Andrew Jackson, Jackson's great quote that our Union, it must and shall be preserved. Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, was a hero to the people of New Orleans. Butler is making sure they know Jackson opposed secession when he was president. Okay, let's get back to what else is happening, why Massachusetts, how and why Massachusetts wins the Civil War. You had, as I said earlier, in Boston, tremendous industry. In South Boston, there were some of the largest iron works in the country along the South Bay. And Cyrus Alger was the owner of the South Boston Iron Works, or the Alger Iron Works. And during the Civil War, the Alger Iron Works in South Boston turn out these huge cannon. The United States has tremendous military capacity and an ability to turn out a lot of weapons of war. So not only are cannon being manufactured in Boston, but also Boston is manufacturing ironclad ships and other really essential pieces of equipment. And Massachusetts, as I said, also very quickly mobilizes lots of people who would not have been abolitionists, come to the support of the Union. This is Fletcher Webster, who is the son of Daniel Webster, the guy I was telling you earlier was so odious. Fletcher Webster leads a regiment in the Civil War, and in fact dies in the Civil War. His regiment is training out on George's Island very early in the war. And when they come marching off of George's Island, someone in their regiment has written a marching song for them. And the marching song is this: John Brown's body. You know, John Brown was an abolitionist. And in 1859, he had tried to seize the armory at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. It's now in West Virginia, with an army made up of people who are fugitives from slavery. And Brown, most of his force were killed. Brown was captured, and Brown was hanged as a traitor in 1859. In one of these episodes that is showing this split happening between the North and South over the issue of slavery. And someone in Fletcher Webster's regiment wrote this song. It was a marching song to the tune of a popular camp meeting song of the day, you know, "Brother, will you meet me on Canaan's happy shore?" And it's a simple song. It's good. It only has essentially 2 lines. And here you can see, "Brother, will you meet me on Canaan's happy shore?" Then repeat, "Brother, will you meet me on Canaan's happy shore?" Then, "Brother, will you meet me on Canaan's happy shore?" Blah, 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 blah. And here you can see the words to this: "John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave." Second line, "John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave." Third line, "John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. His soul is marching on." You know, it's easy to remember, easy to sing. And it's very much an anti-slavery song. And Fletcher Webster's regiment marches up State Street singing this. And they took the song to a local printing shop, turned out copies, it's distributed throughout town. And when word gets to Washington that you have this regiment in Massachusetts singing about John Brown's body, they forbid any soldiers in the Union Army from singing this song because it's an anti-slavery song. And at this moment, the United States is still committed to ending this war without necessarily ending the institution of slavery. They want the slave-owning states to come back into the Union. And at this time, that is the spring of 1861, a number of slave-holding states have remained loyal to the Union. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland. You know, Virginia just secedes in April. There was the hope that Tennessee might not secede. So you don't want, if you're the Lincoln administration, the war to be about slavery. And here you have this group of troops in Massachusetts singing about this hero to the abolitionists who had been hanged by the United States as a traitor. So Union troops forbidden to sing this particular song as they're marching off to the off to war. Okay. And this then brings us to this woman, Julia Ward Howe. Julia Ward Howe's husband was Samuel Gridley Howe, whom I think I mentioned last time as the proprietor for the Perkins School for the Blind. And Dr. Howe was one of the most noted American men of science because he was a proprietor of the Perkins School for the Blind. And his wife, Julia, was a New York socialite who had married him and moved to Boston. And apparently, but everything I hear about Samuel Gridley Howe, and I really shouldn't tell you this, he wasn't a very pleasant person. And Mrs. Howe, by all accounts, was. The two of them were very much opposed to the institution of slavery. And when the war began, they were very happy with the beginning of the war because they knew the war would end slavery. But then something really strange and difficult happens for the Howes. And that is this. The first Massachusetts troops die just a few days after the war begins. I should also say the commander of the federal garrison at Fort Sumter in South Carolina was Robert Anderson. And the Fort Sumter is fired upon by the South Carolina militia and bombarded for about 24 hours before Anderson is forced to surrender Fort Sumter. And it is the surrender of Fort Sumter then that's going to lead people like Fletcher Webster, Benjamin Franklin Butler, Thomas Cass to say, well, we support the Union because here someone is fired on the American flag. And in Boston, the Black community, which mainly lived on Beacon Hill, immediately petitions to change the name of one of the major streets on Beacon Hill to Anderson Street. If you've wondered, if you've walked around Beacon Hill, why there is an Anderson Street, it was named for Robert Anderson, the commander of Fort Sumter, forced to surrender by the Confederates, and named actually at the behest of Boston's Black community. So, Mrs. Howe, though, welcomes the beginning of the war. And then when the first Massachusetts soldiers die in Baltimore, their bodies are brought back to Massachusetts, and Governor Andrew presides over a funeral for them at King's Chapel. And Mrs. Howe is really struck by this. She goes to the funeral, and she realizes we had celebrated the beginning of this war, and this war is going to kill a lot of people. And among those who will die in the war won't be Julia Ward Howe or her husband, the good abolitionists, but lots of young men. And that's a troubling thing. Think, okay, we think the end of the war is going to be just, but meanwhile, this is going to cause an extraordinary amount of death and suffering. So it gives her some second thoughts about war as an instrument to achieve social good. Now, at the same time, President Lincoln wants to make sure that the Civil War is the first war in American history or in world history in which there won't be as many deaths from disease as there are from combat. For most of human history, most people who have died in war have died from diseases rather than from battle. And it's because in camps, you're likely to contract a disease. Camps typically are dirty, not very good medical care. And so Lincoln wants to make sure camps are clean. And so who better to oversee cleanliness and hygiene among troops than the leading American man of science and proprietor of an institution like the Perkins School for the Blind, Samuel Gridley Howe. So President Lincoln invites Samuel Gridley Howe to come to Washington to be director of the United States Sanitary Commission, USSC, to oversee sanitation, hygiene, as well as things like the treatment of men who are injured in battle. While we're on the subject, I should mention Oliver Wendell Holmes, Boston physician and poet, who had written an essay about a dozen years earlier about puerperal fever, which was a killer of women giving birth. And puerperal fever seemed to spread mysteriously. No one quite sure what caused it, but Holmes unlocks the great secret of puerperal fever And the instrument spreading this disease tended to be the hands of the doctor. And what Holmes looked at were the statistics of women who died from puerperal fever and the attending physician, and then what else the attending physician had done that day. If you were the first woman whom a physician treated in childbirth, in a given day, your chances of survival were quite good. If you're the second, third, or fourth, your chances of survival were negligible. And Holmes deduced from this that the real problem was doctors weren't washing their hands. Now, doctors resisted this idea that they needed to wash their hands. They thought that this is before there was any idea about germs spreading. Holmes, though, says, puerperal fever is caused by doctors not washing their hands. The idea that doctors should wash their hands really doesn't take off until the Civil War, when we have massive cases of doctors having to attend to people with very serious wounds and realizing that they should wash their hands between. Anyway, we've gotten a little ahead of the story of Julia Ward Howe and her husband going to Washington so he can take command of the United States Sanitary Commission. And what really strikes her along this train ride to Washington is this tremendous mobilization of young men marching also to Washington to go to the defense of the Capitol and the Union. Tremendous outpouring of this massive mobilization. President Lincoln had called for 50,000 volunteers to be ready to defend the Union by July of 1861. He anticipated the war would be over by then. And so 50,000 volunteers. All in all, it's going to be several hundreds of thousands of young men who are going to serve in this war before it's over. And all along the route to Washington, Julia Ward Howe sees this tremendous mobilization and gets to Washington. Her husband is busy setting up the Sanitary Commission. She and some friends actually go and visit with the troops from Massachusetts. She is the first woman to speak to Massachusetts troops, that is, give a public speech to groups of Massachusetts soldiers who have gone to the defense of Washington. This is in the summer of 1861. And she is thinking about this mobilization, these people turning out to fight in a war which she knows is not going to cost her very much. And she's really thinking about all of this, as well as thinking about that song that one of Fletcher Webster's soldiers had written back in April about John Brown's body, a song that Union troops were not permitted to sing. And she liked to write poetry. Her husband thought writing poetry was a silly thing to do. Consequently, she learned how to write poetry in the dark when Samuel Ridley Howe was asleep. And late that night, she gets up in the dark of this hotel room in Washington because a poem had occurred to her. And she writes it down. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and damps. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His day is marching on. You can see this imagery of a mobilization, these 100 circling camps. And what she sees isn't necessarily just these hundreds of troops, but an altar built to God, who's now the righteous sentence they can read by the dim and flaring lamps of these Union camps. I have read a fiery gospel writ in burnished rows of steel. As you deal with my condemners, so with you my grace shall deal. Let the hero born of woman crush the serpent with his heel, the serpent of rebellion. Of course, the serpent is the tempter in the Old Testament, since God is marching on. He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on. And in the final verse, in the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free while God is marching on. She comes back to Boston and shows it to her friend, who is the publisher of the Atlantic Monthly. And here you can see the February 1862 issue, it's on the cover. Her friend had given it the title, The Battle Hymn of the Republic. President Lincoln, by the way, who had banned the singing of John Brown's Body, loves this song. And this essentially becomes the national anthem during the Civil War, written by this woman who had gone to Washington as her husband was setting up the Sanitary Commission. Now, the Howes remain abolitionists during the war. And our friend Thomas Cass, who had commanded the Columbian Guards, he remobilizes when the war begins. And he becomes a colonel of the Massachusetts 9th Volunteer Infantry, a regiment made up almost entirely of Irish immigrants. Cass had just recently been elected to public office in Boston. He was elected to the school committee, and now the Columbian Guards reform as the 9th Regiment, and they march south to the defense of Washington. Before they leave town, and though, as they march up Beacon Street, they are presented their battle flag by Mrs. Harrison Gray Otis, the widow of Boston's 3rd mayor, and really the grande dame of Boston politics. At her home on Beacon Street, a home that still stands, she presents them with their colors, a green flag, green appropriate since they're Irish, and with it, Colonel Cass and the 9th Regiment move south, and they're actually stationed on the former plantation of Robert E. Lee, which is actually now the site of the Arlington National Cemetery. And here, one of Cass's officers, they have long conversations with the people on Lee's plantation, people who had been Robert E. Lee's slaves. And they realize, one of them says, that the destinies of these two people, the Irish and the African Americans, were intertwined here in the American Republic. And here you have a shot of Colonel Cass leading the 9th Regiment at Fredericksburg. At Malvern Hill in Virginia, he was shot through the jaw and was brought home, where he died in early 1863. And here is his statue in the Boston Public Garden. Again, Massachusetts plays an outsized role in the war in a number of ways. One is through mobilization and sending troops, which is, among the first to send troops. Second is through the industrial capacity, building of cannon and ironclad ships. And third is through this idea of liberty, the ideas of liberty. You can see it rooted in the anti-slavery movement, but then subscribed to by others who had been lukewarm about the anti-slavery movement. And then finally, actually, in the memory of the war. During the war, a lithographer, actually the whole science of lithography is invented during the war. And one of the pioneers of lithography was a guy named Louis Prang in Roxbury. And he develops a technique to mass produce color prints of things. So the Civil War is the first war in which we have vivid color images mass produced of battles. Here you can see a battle in Franklin, Tennessee. Another scene, they have a couple of other scenes I can show you of episodes during the war. Here's a night attack. This is Louis Prang, and this is his home in Roxbury, which still stands near to where the factory is, and the factory building still stands. Tremendous technical expertise it takes to make an image like this and then have it colored. By the way, it is chromolithography is also going to be responsible after the war for Massachusetts being the center of two other industries that rely on it. One is greeting cards. There's a market, not an unlimited market, for colored prints of major battles. There's a much bigger market for greeting cards. And in fact, in the 1870s, when Julia Ward Howe is home from Washington, having written the Battle Hymn of the Republic, the song that wins the war. She sees in the wake of this big war that we should have a campaign to make sure wars don't happen again. And after the American Civil War, there's a major war between France and Germany. And in fact, in Boston in the 1870s, they build a peace pavilion in Copley Square, an enormous building to celebrate peace and perpetuate peace. Julia Ward Howe doesn't necessarily think celebrations of celebrating peace are enough, and she thinks the group who would be most interested in preserving peace are mothers. So she wants to create a Mother's Day for Peace in May. So mothers would be recognized, and mothers would want us not to go to war with each other. So Julia Ward Howe, in addition to writing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, is in many ways responsible for Mother's Day. And fortunately, Louis Prang is able to make greeting cards, which you should remember in May to send to your mother, so as a remembrance. And another thing that comes out of the chromolithography are board games. Massachusetts becomes a center for the board game industry, companies like Parker Brothers, which get into the business of board games in the late 19th century, thanks to the chromolithography technique. Okay, are there any questions, by the way? I think I'm just talking freely.
I'm good.
Okay, thank you, Sana. Okay, so the other, of course, big thing that happens during the war, well, a lot of big things happen during the war. And in 1862, by 1862, it's clear the war is not going to be over as quickly as the Lincoln administration had anticipated. And so President Lincoln in September issues an Emancipation Proclamation. That is, recognizing that we do need to make the war about slavery. And in one sense, the Emancipation Proclamation is a threat to the Confederate States. If you've read it, you know it says, as of January 1st of 1863, any person held as a slave in any state or any part of a state, which shall be, at the time of this proclamation, currently in rebellion against the United States, will be thenceforward and forever after free. So in September, Lincoln issues this and says, on January 1st, if you are still fighting, then the people you hold as slaves will be free. And you can say, well, that doesn't seem to matter much because these people don't recognize Lincoln's authority. And they're not going to say on January 1st, hey, you know what, Lincoln, whom we don't recognize as president, has just said we can't hold slaves. But it's the next part of the proclamation that really has force. It says the army, the military forces of the United States will support any such persons in any actions they may take to secure their freedom. So Lincoln is promising to use the Army and Navy of the United States to help enslaved people secure their freedom. What he's really calling for is a massive uprising of enslaved people in states that are in rebellion against the United States. That's part of it. And of course, the other part is if by January 1st, these people in the Confederate States say, hey, we don't want to be part of this anymore and lay down their arms, then who knows? They might have been able to keep their enslaved people. So it's a real, it's a political move. It's also a military move. As Lincoln is doing this under his powers as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And he is still pushing for the states which had slaves, which had not seceded, to gradually end slavery. He tries to get the Delaware legislature to agree to a compensated emancipation plan, and they won't. Congress does end the slave trade in the District of Columbia, and also ends slavery in the District of Columbia, but doesn't go much further than that. Anyway, Thanksgiving Day in 1862, and Thanksgiving is very much a New England holiday. It becomes a national holiday during the Civil War. Governor Andrew has dinner with Lewis Hayden at Hayden's house on Beacon Hill. And they recognize that on January 1st, Lincoln is going to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. And that likely could mean African Americans can enlist in the Army of the United States. And so they make plans to have Massachusetts raise the first companies of African Americans, something, by the way, Lincoln supported. And Lincoln said that the mere sight of 50,000 armed and trained Black troops on the banks of the Mississippi will end the rebellion. So Andrew and Hayden make plans to raise a regiment of African Americans. And to command the regiment, Andrew appoints Robert Gould Shaw, who is the son of abolitionists from Beacon Hill. Shaw isn't an abolitionist himself. He had, however, been a lieutenant and had been seriously wounded at the Battle of Fredericksburg and comes home to recover. And while he is home, the governor wants to appoint him to be the commander of this Black regiment. And he doesn't want to do it. He didn't know if African Americans actually could fight. Of course, a lot of African Americans are very much interested in proving that they can. Among the men who enlist in the regiment are the two sons of Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, and others, mainly who are free. And William Carney becomes the master sergeant. The Lincoln administration makes it clear Black soldiers can enlist as of January 1st, but all of the officers will be white. They're not going to have Black officers. And after seeing the men training at Reedville in what is now Hyde Park, and once the troops are on their ships heading for South Carolina, Shaw appoints Carney to be the master sergeant of the regiment. So the highest non-commissioned officer, African-American non-commissioned officer, actually will be until much later in the century. So Shaw and the Massachusetts 54th Regiment march to the wharfs and then take ships to South Carolina. By the way, while they're in camp in Reedville, the soldiers learn that they are not paid as much as white troops. And so they refuse to accept their pay until they are paid the same. It's a protest by these men who refuse to accept any pay unless they are recognized as equals of the white troops. And in the summer of 1863, the Massachusetts 54th leads the assault on Fort Wagner, an island on one of the Sea Islands of South Carolina. And in that, some 180 of the men are killed, along with Colonel Shaw, and all are buried in a mass grave. Sergeant Carney sees the flag bearer shot, and he takes the flag of the Massachusetts 54th and tucks it under his coat, crawls back to the Union lines and gets back and says, "The dear old flag never touched the ground." And it really is demonstrating their personal courage and their willingness to fight that is going to lead the way to the Massachusetts 54th and other people of color who show their ability to serve the United States, a country that had only recently regarded them as property. So, by the way, Carney in 1900, that is some 40 years later, receives the Congressional Medal of Honor, the first African American to receive it. So you have, and then in the 1890s, one of our assignments, of course, is to look at some monuments. And we saw the Webster Monument earlier and a potential Webster Monument. In the 1890s, the Shaw family commissions Augustus St. Gaudens, an American sculptor, to do a monument to their son, which stands facing the State House. And St. Gaudens does Colonel Shaw on his horse, and then sculpted each of these individual soldiers as individual characters in this very dramatic piece as they're marching along Beacon Street, heading towards South Carolina in 1863. Here's another Civil War monument. This is actually the first Civil War monument in Boston, and this is a monument to the soldiers and sailors that stands in the middle of the Common. And at the top, you see the figure of Liberty, and then here around the base, actually, now, this was taken when the statues were out for repair. They're statues of soldiers and sailors standing around the base, as well as fame and history who were recording their deeds. And here you can see the sculpture, Martin Milmore. By the way, Wendell Phillips, the abolitionist, really hated this monument when it was unveiled in the early 1880s because it doesn't really talk about slavery. It does talk about keeping the Union whole, destroying slavery, but it really is about the soldiers and sailors. Here, actually, you can see the soldiers and the sailors around the base. And another shot of the monument from shortly after it was built. And it has recognizable people in it. Here is Governor Andrew. I know that Julia Ward Howe and her husband are in this. This one shows the soldiers leaving. And then here is a scene from the United States Sanitary Commission. This is Martin Milmore, the sculptor. And on the other side, it shows the soldiers returning from war. It's been considerably improved since I took these pictures some years ago. So it's in better shape now that it's been in a long time, the center of the Common. And, the soldiers are shown going past the State House, both as they leave and as they come back. And those of you who have looked into the history of the State House know there are only 3 occasions when the center doors of the State House open. And one involves when a Massachusetts regiment is either leaving or coming back from war. They get their colors at the State House and then return them at the State House. The other time is when a governor leaves office. The governor walks out of the main doors, of the central doors of the State House, walks down the steps and becomes a private citizen. And actually, the tradition of the governor leaving by himself began in the 1880s when Benjamin Franklin Butler was the governor. And he was a guy who made a lot of enemies because he was always very outspoken. And no one wanted to be seen with him when he was done as governor. So he left by himself and got along happily ever after. And then the third occasion when the center doors open is when a visiting head of state comes to Boston and is received at the State House. Otherwise, everyone else uses other doors, and the governor only uses the doors once, and that's when he or she is leaving office for the final time. So you have the Civil War has a profound impact on Boston. And here in the Common, we see these 2 monuments, the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, which is on the highest point of the Common. And imagine this is the only real war monument in Boston at this time was the Bunker Hill Monument. So building this one in the center of the Common was quite a notable undertaking. And as I said, Wendell Phillips didn't like it. Then a short distance away, you have the Massachusetts 54th. And then, of course, there is another monument in front of the State House. Here is Daniel Webster. And when Webster's monument went up in the late 1850s, those who didn't like Webster were really quite horrified at having a statue of Daniel Webster standing in front of the State House. And later in the 1850s, at about the same time Webster's statue went up, Horace Mann died. And Mann had been the president of the Massachusetts State Senate and also became the first secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education, really becomes responsible for public education in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Constitution does require that education be supported. This is not only the college at Cambridge, but the grammar schools in each town. And Mann establishes a standard for education for the state. And he inspects schools all around the state and also creates normal schools, that is, schools that establish a norm for teaching. Essentially, the first teacher colleges in the United States. And so Mann, very important figure, but this isn't the reason his statue is in front of the State House. In the early 1850s, he had left Massachusetts to become the president of Antioch College, a college in Ohio that was one of the few colleges in the country to admit African Americans as well as women. And Mann is an outspoken abolitionist. When he died in 1859, those who were sore about having Daniel Webster in front of the State House said, we're going to put Horace Mann in front of the State House too. These two guys who represent polar opposite ideas in American politics. Webster supporting slavery, Mann opposing it. And so the supporters of Mann actually enlist help from another Bostonian, Charlotte Cushman. This is Charlotte Cushman, who might be the most famous American actress of the 19th century. She was born in Boston and in fact becomes the first woman for whom a public building in Boston will be named. It's a school in the North End near where she was born. And she's born not long after theater had been legalized in Boston. And she goes to Europe because that's a much better place to be an actress than here, and was famous for her role, mainly her big role was as Queen Catherine in Shakespeare's Henry VIII. And she would spend the play season in London acting on the London stage, and then in the winter would go to Italy, where she lived quite happily. So didn't spend a whole lot of time in Boston. During the Civil War, she does come home to the United States and gives benefits to raise money for the troops. So she, very powerful woman, and Mann's widow thought her husband would want a woman to do his statue. And fortunately, Charlotte Cushman's longtime companion was a woman named Harriet Hosmer, who was a sculptor. And so Cushman is put on the committee to oversee the Mann sculpture, and Cushman gets the contract for Harriet Hosmer, and Harriet Hosmer does complete Horace Mann's statue. This is Charlotte Cushman in one of her roles. She also, by the way, would play Romeo. This was a way to get her sister the opportunity to play Juliet. Here's Charlotte Cushman. Extraordinarily famous. By the way, if you go into the Parker House on the lower level, they have the door of the room where Charles Dickens stayed and also where Charlotte Cushman died. She winds up dying in the Parker House at a time when it was a residential hotel. And Harriet Hosmer does complete the statue of Horace Mann, which stands in front of the statue. Again, a Civil War era statue. And I tell you this because we do have controversy about monuments and statues today. And these two guys are there not because they were both white guys who died and we wanted to build a statue to everyone, but because they represent different things. So when you are looking at a statue, think about why it is there and what it represents and what it's supposed to get you to think about. The statue isn't there for you to kneel before. It's there to get you to think about what this person represented, and for good or ill. Also, during the Civil War years, the Archdiocese of Boston builds a new cathedral, on Washington Street and recently restored. And I think I could go on. So Boston, responsible for winning the Civil War, both through the supply of men and arms and through the writing of songs and other cultural effusions. And that's it for today. I'll see you again next week. Are there any questions?
No, thank you so much.
Okay, I appreciate, by the way, those of you who have put your mystery photo on the blog, good work. I look forward to the rest of you. Let's see, I know Emma and Sana and Amber so far have identified their picture, meaning the rest of you have an opportunity to look at what they've done and see what you should be doing. So I look forward to seeing what you find out.
See you tonight. See you guys.
Thank you, Professor.
Take care.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you.